The morning mist hung thick over the wilderness camp as Jake Morrison checked his beaver traps along the frozen creek. His massive frame moved quietly through the snow-covered forest, a skill learned from years of living alone in the Canadian wilderness. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing over 200 pounds, Jake was known throughout the territory as the Giant Trapper. His reputation preceded him in every trading post and settlement for hundreds of miles. Jake had been living this solitary life for 8 years now, ever since he left civilization behind after a terrible accident at the lumber mill had claimed his younger brother's life. The guilt and grief had driven him deep into the untamed wilderness where he could exist without the painful reminders of his past. His only companions were the occasional traders who passed through and the wildlife that shared his domain. On this particular morning, something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. As Jake approached his most remote trap line near Eagle Rock, he noticed unusual tracks in the snow. They were small human footprints, but so tiny they could only belong to children. His weathered face creased with concern. No children should be this far from any settlement, especially not in the dead of winter when temperatures dropped well below freezing. Following the tracks, Jake's heart began to race as he realized they were leading toward the dangerous cliff area where many animals had fallen to their deaths over the years. The footprints were erratic, suggesting whoever made them was struggling through the deep snow. He quickened his pace, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold air. As he rounded a large pine tree, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. There, huddled, together against a fallen log, were two of the smallest children he had ever seen. They appeared to be Native American twins, probably no more than 4 or 5 years old. Their dark hair was matted with snow, and their thin clothing was completely inadequate for the harsh winter conditions. Both children were shivering violently, their lips blue with cold. Jake's first instinct was to approach them immediately, but he had learned to be cautious around frightened wildlife, and he suspected these children would be just as skittish. Instead, he slowly removed his heavy coat and began to move toward them with careful, deliberate steps. The twins looked up at him with enormous brown eyes filled with terror and exhaustion. The little girl, who seemed to be the braver of the two, struggled to her feet and stepped protectively in front of her brother. Despite her obvious weakness, she raised her tiny chin defiantly and spoke in broken English mixed with what Jake recognized as Cree. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear enough for Jake to understand that she was begging him not to hurt them. Jake knelt down in the snow to make himself less intimidating and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. He had picked up some Cree words over the years from trading with various tribes, and he did his best to reassure them that he meant no harm. The children remained frozen in place, clearly torn between their fear of this giant stranger and their desperate need for help. As Jake looked more closely at the twins, he realized they were in far worse condition than he had initially thought. Both children showed signs of severe exposure and malnutrition. Their faces were gaunt, and he could see that they hadn't eaten properly in days, possibly weeks. The little boy had a nasty cut on his forehead that had frozen over, and both children were suffering from what appeared to be frostbite on their fingers and toes. The girl continued to speak in her mixture of Cree and English, and slowly Jake began to piece together fragments of their story. From what he could understand, they had been separated from their family during some kind of terrible event. The word fire kept coming up in her desperate explanation, along with references to soldiers and running. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized these children might be survivors of one of the brutal conflicts that had been plaguing the region between government forces and native tribes. Time was running out. Jake could see that both children were on the verge of collapse from hypothermia. The little boy had stopped shivering, which Jake knew was actually a dangerous sign indicating the final stages of severe cold exposure. If he didn't act quickly, both children would die within hours. Making a decision that would change all their lives forever, Jake slowly stood up and extended his massive hand toward the little girl. She looked at his outstretched palm for what seemed like an eternity, then turned to whisper something to her brother in their native language. The boy nodded weakly, and with trembling steps, the girl placed her tiny, frozen hand in Jake's enormous one. The moment their hands touched, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The protective instinct that he thought had died with his brother suddenly roared back to life. These weren't just two lost children who needed temporary help. Looking into their eyes, Jake saw the same kind of pain and loss that had driven him into the wilderness. But unlike him, they were innocent victims who deserved a chance at life and happiness. Without wasting another moment, Jake scooped up both children in his arms. They weighed almost nothing, which only emphasized how malnourished they were. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck while her brother curled up against his chest, both of them instinctively seeking the warmth of his body. As Jake began the long journey back to his cabin, he knew that his life of solitude was about to end. These children would need more than just immediate rescue. They would need someone to protect them, feed them, and help them heal from whatever terrible trauma had brought them to this desperate situation. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison had found a purpose beyond just surviving each day. The giant trapper who had fled from human contact was about to discover that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from running away from responsibility, but from embracing it completely. With each step through the snow toward his cabin, Jake felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. These tiny twins had accomplished something that years of solitude couldn't achieve. They had reminded him what it meant to be human. Jake's cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a beacon of hope. The sturdy log structure had been his sanctuary for years, built with his own hands using timber from the surrounding forest. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth for the frozen children in his arms. As he pushed through the heavy wooden door, the contrast between the bitter cold outside and the cozy interior was immediate and dramatic. The cabin was spartanly furnished but clean and well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, casting dancing shadows across handmade wooden furniture. Animal pelts served as rugs and blankets, while shelves lined the walls holding Jake's collection of books, tools, and supplies. It was a man's dwelling, practical and efficient, but lacking any feminine touches or signs that children had ever been welcome here. Jake gently placed the twins near the fireplace and quickly stoked the flames higher. The children huddled together, their eyes darting around the unfamiliar space with a mixture of curiosity and lingering fear. The warmth began to work its magic immediately, and color slowly started to return to their pale faces. However, Jake knew that warming them too quickly could be dangerous after severe exposure, so he carefully monitored their condition while gathering supplies. Moving with surprising gentleness for such a large man, Jake prepared warm water in a basin and found clean cloths. He had basic medical supplies from his years of treating his own injuries in the wilderness, and he set about examining the twins' frost-bitten extremities. The little girl, who seemed to be the spokesperson for the pair, watched his every move, with intelligent eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. As Jake carefully cleaned the boy's head wound, the girl began to speak more freely. Her English was better than he had initially realized, suggesting she had received some education, possibly at one of the mission schools that had been established in various native communities. Slowly, the tragic story began to unfold. The twins' names were Ayana and Dakota, meaning eternal blossom and friend to everyone respectively. They were part of a small Cree band that had been living peacefully near a government outpost. Ayana's voice trembled as she described the night that changed everything. Government soldiers had arrived without warning, claiming that the tribe was harboring fugitives who had been involved in an uprising at another settlement. The accusations were false, but the soldiers were in no mood to listen to explanations. What started as a demand for information quickly escalated into violence when the tribal elder refused to hand over young men who had nothing to do with any uprising. The confrontation had turned deadly when someone fired a shot. In the chaos that followed, buildings were set ablaze and families scattered in all directions. Ayana grabbed her brother's hand, and they ran into the forest as their world literally went up in flames behind them. For weeks, they had wandered through the wilderness, surviving on berries, roots, and whatever small game they could catch with their bare hands. Jake listened to this account with growing anger and sadness. He had heard rumors of similar incidents throughout the territory, where misunderstandings between government forces and native tribes had led to tragedy. The fact that these innocent children had been forced to endure such trauma and then struggle for survival in the harsh wilderness filled him with a protective rage he hadn't felt since his brother's death. As night fell, Jake faced the practical challenge of caring for his unexpected guests. He had no children's clothing, no proper beds for them, and no experience dealing with traumatized youngsters. Using his resourcefulness, he created makeshift sleeping areas near the fireplace using animal pelts and soft furs. The twins seemed grateful for any comfort after weeks of sleeping on the cold ground. Preparing food presented another challenge. Jake's diet consisted mainly of game meat, fish, and preserved vegetables. The children were clearly malnourished, so he needed to be careful about what he fed them. He prepared a simple broth with small pieces of rabbit meat and wild onions, along with some cornmeal he had obtained from traders. The twins ate slowly but eagerly, their bodies desperate for nutrition. During the meal, Jake began to see glimpses of what these children must have been like before their traumatic experience. Despite everything they had endured, Dakota had a shy smile that occasionally broke through his fearful exterior. Ayanna showed remarkable resilience and intelligence, asking questions about Jake's life and the various animal pelts decorating his cabin. She was clearly trying to understand whether this giant man could truly be trusted. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself faced with a decision that would define the rest of his life. The nearest settlement was over 100 miles away, and even then there was no guarantee that the children would be safe or properly cared for. The authorities might simply place them in an orphanage or attempt to relocate them to a distant reservation where they knew no one. After what they had experienced, Jake couldn't bear the thought of these innocent souls facing further abandonment. The twins fell asleep, curled up together near the fire, their small bodies finally relaxed for the first time in weeks. As Jake watched over them through the night, he made a silent vow. These children had been through enough. Whatever it took, he would protect them from any further harm. The giant trapper, who had spent years avoiding human contact, was about to become a guardian to two of the most vulnerable people in the entire territory. When morning came, Jake woke to find Ayanna sitting up and watching him with those wise, dark eyes. She spoke softly in Cree, then translated for him. "Dakota says you have a good spirit. I think he is right." It was the first time she had smiled since he found them, and that simple expression of trust hit Jake harder than any physical blow ever could. From that moment on, Jake knew there was no going back. These children had chosen to trust him with their lives, and he would spend every remaining day proving himself worthy of that trust. The healing process would be long and difficult for all of them, but for the first time in years, Jake felt like he had a real reason to hope for the future. The first weeks with Ayanna and Dakota tested every survival skill Jake had learned during his years in the wilderness. Caring for traumatized children proved far more challenging than trapping animals or weathering fierce storms. The twins spoke little during the day, communicating mostly with each other in whispered Cree. At night, they would wake screaming from nightmares about burning buildings and thundering hooves, clinging to each other in terror until Jake's gentle voice could coax them back to sleep. Jake quickly realized that his cabin needed significant modifications to accommodate his new family. He spent long hours crafting proper furniture sized for small children, including miniature chairs and a table where they could eat comfortably. Using skills learned from native traders over the years, he began making appropriate clothing from the softest deer hide he could find. His large, calloused hands worked carefully to create tiny moccasins and warm winter garments that would protect them from the harsh Canadian cold. Communication remained a constant challenge. While Ayanna spoke reasonable English, Dakota had been younger when their family was destroyed and relied heavily on his sister for translation. Jake began learning more Cree words each day, often pointing to objects around the cabin and asking the children to teach him their names in their native language. This exchange became a bonding ritual that helped break down the barriers of fear and mistrust. Food preparation became an art form as Jake learned to cater to their small appetites and traumatized digestive systems. He discovered that Dakota had a sweet tooth and would brighten considerably when offered maple syrup tapped from the trees around their cabin. Ayanna preferred savory foods and showed particular interest in the wild plants Jake gathered, often pointing out varieties she recognized from her life before the tragedy. Through these small preferences, their individual personalities began to emerge. The turning point came during a fierce blizzard that trapped them inside the cabin for 5 straight days. With nothing but time and each other's company, the walls began to come down. Jake told them stories about his life before the wilderness, carefully editing out the more painful details about his brother's death. In return, Ayanna began sharing memories of their parents and their life in the village before it was destroyed. Dakota, who had remained almost entirely silent since Jake found them, finally spoke his first direct words to his guardian. It happened during a quiet evening as Jake was repairing a trap by firelight. The little boy approached cautiously and said in careful English, "Jake, thank you for saving us." The simple words hit the giant trapper like a physical blow, and he had to turn away to hide the tears that sprang to his eyes. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the children began to show signs of healing. They started exploring the area, immediately around the cabin, always staying within sight but showing curiosity about the natural world that surrounded their new home. Jake became their patient teacher, showing them how to identify different animal tracks in the mud, which plants were safe to eat, and how to read the signs that predicted changes in weather. The twins proved to be remarkably quick learners. Ayanna had a natural gift for understanding animal behavior and could predict where Jake would find the best trap locations. Dakota showed an unexpected talent for craftsmanship, helping Jake repair tools and even attempting to carve small animals from pieces of wood. These activities gave them purpose and helped rebuild their confidence in their ability to survive and thrive. One morning in late spring, Jake faced his first major decision as a guardian. A group of traders passed through the area, men he had dealt with for years who knew him as a solitary figure. When they saw the children, their curiosity was immediate and intense. Where had they come from? Were they his children? Had he taken them from their families? Jake realized that their isolated existence couldn't last forever, and eventually they would need to interact with the outside world. The lead trader, a weathered French-Canadian named Pierre Dubois, was someone Jake trusted more than most. Over evening coffee, Jake told him the truth about finding the twins and their tragic background. Pierre listened gravely, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline and the location where they had been found. When Jake finished his account, Pierre nodded slowly and offered information that changed everything. There had indeed been a terrible incident at a Cree settlement 3 months earlier, Pierre confirmed. Government soldiers had acted on false information and overreacted to perceived resistance. Several families had been scattered and many people were still unaccounted for. Most significantly, there were relatives of Ayanna and Dakota who had survived and were desperately searching for any trace of the missing children. Jake's heart sank as he realized what this meant. The twins had family members who loved them and wanted them back. As much as he had come to care for them, as much as they had filled the empty spaces in his heart, he had no legal or moral right to keep them from their surviving relatives. The decision he had to make would be the hardest of his entire life. That night, after the traders had set up their temporary camp, Jake sat with Ayanna and Dakota by the fire and gently explained what he had learned. The children listened in silence, processing the information that their aunt and uncle, along with several cousins, were alive and looking for them. Ayanna translated everything for Dakota, whose English was still limited to simple phrases. The twins' reaction surprised Jake. Instead of immediate joy at the prospect of reuniting with family, they seemed conflicted and uncertain. Ayanna spoke for both of them when she said, "But Jake, you are our family now too. We don't want to leave you alone again." Dakota nodded vigorously, wrapping his small arms around Jake's massive forearm in a gesture of fierce loyalty. Jake found himself torn between his love for the children and his knowledge of what was right. He had given them safety and care during their darkest time, but he wasn't their real family. They deserved to grow up knowing their heritage and culture, surrounded by people who shared their blood and traditions. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence felt unbearable after months of laughter, purpose, and the deep satisfaction of watching the twins heal and grow. The solution, when it came, would surprise everyone involved and test the very foundations of what it meant to be a family. But for now, Jake simply held the children close and promised them that whatever happened, they would face it together. The giant trapper had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is being willing to sacrifice your own happiness for the welfare of those you care about most. The journey to reunite the twins with their surviving family members took 3 days through terrain that tested even Jake's wilderness skills. Pierre Dubois had agreed to guide them to the temporary camp where the scattered members of the Cree band had regrouped after the tragic incident months earlier. The children rode double on Jake's strongest horse, while he walked alongside, his eyes constantly scanning the forest for any signs of danger. Ayana and Dakota were unusually quiet. During the trip, their earlier excitement about seeing family again now mixed with uncertainty about what lay ahead. They had grown comfortable with their life in Jake's cabin, and the prospect of another major change filled them with anxiety. Jake tried to reassure them with stories about the importance of knowing their heritage and being part of their true community, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. As they approached the camp, Jake felt his own nervousness growing. What if the family blamed him for not bringing the children back sooner? What if they thought he had tried to steal them away from their people? Most troubling of all, what if Ayana and Dakota decided they wanted to stay with him instead of returning to their blood relatives? The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like the heaviest pack he had ever carried. The Cree camp was larger than Jake had expected, with perhaps 50 people living in a mixture of traditional teepees and makeshift shelters. As their small group approached, word spread quickly through the community. People emerged from their dwellings, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and hope. When someone finally recognized the twins, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A middle-aged woman broke from the crowd and ran toward them, tears streaming down her weathered face. She called out in Cree, her voice breaking with emotion, as she reached up to pull the children down from the horse. This was their aunt, Marie Crowfeather, their father's sister who had feared them dead for all these months. Behind her came their uncle, Joseph, along with 3 cousins who had grown taller in the months since the tragedy. The reunion was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. Marie held the twins as if she would never let them go again, speaking rapidly in Cree while tears flowed freely down all their faces. The other family members gathered around, touching the children's faces and hands as if to convince themselves that this miraculous return was real. For several minutes, Jake stood forgotten on the edge of this emotional circle, feeling like an outsider intruding on something sacred. When Marie finally looked up at Jake, her expression was unreadable. She spoke in careful English, her voice thick with emotion. "You are the man who found them?" When Jake nodded, she studied his face intently for a long moment. Then, to his complete surprise, she reached out and grasped his hands in both of hers. "The Creator sent you to save our children. We can never repay this debt." The formal introductions that followed revealed the full extent of the tragedy that had befallen their family. Marie explained that the twins' parents had both died in the violence that destroyed their settlement. Several other family members had also perished, and those who survived had scattered in different directions during the chaos. It had taken weeks for the surviving relatives to find each other and establish this temporary camp, while they decided where to rebuild their lives. As the day progressed, Jake watched the twins slowly reconnect with their extended family. There was joy in the reunion, but also an underlying sadness as they learned the full extent of their losses. Dakota seemed to adapt more quickly, playing with his cousins and beginning to remember Cree words that had been buried under months of trauma. Ayana was more reserved, staying close to either Jake or Marie as she processed all the changes. That evening, the tribal council called a formal meeting to discuss the twins' future. Jake was invited to participate, an honor that surprised him, given his status as an outsider. The discussion was conducted in both Cree and English, with Marie serving as translator when needed. Various options were debated, from keeping the children with the band as they relocated to a new settlement, to sending them to live with distant relatives in other territories. During the discussion, something unexpected happened. Ayana stood up and asked permission to speak, something that clearly surprised the adults given her young age. In a clear, strong voice that reminded Jake of the brave little girl who had protected her brother in the forest, she addressed the council in both languages. "My brother and I have lost our parents and our home," she began. "Jake found us when we were dying and gave us new life. He fed us, clothed us, and taught us to be strong again. We are grateful to be with our family, but Jake is also our family. Now, we do not want him to be alone again when he saved us from being alone forever." The simplicity and wisdom of her words stunned the adults into silence. Dakota nodded vigorously and added in his limited English, "Jake is good father to us. We love him too." The council members exchanged glances, clearly moved by the children's loyalty to their guardian. Marie spoke up thoughtfully. "These children speak truth. They have been through much pain, and this man helped heal their spirits. We must consider what is best for them, not just what tradition expects." She turned to Jake with a question that would change all their lives. "Would you consider staying with our people? We need strong men who understand the old ways and the new world." The children could grow up knowing both their heritage and the man who gave them hope. Jake's mind reeled at the unexpected proposition. Stay with the tribe? Become part of their community rather than returning to his solitary existence? The idea was both terrifying and appealing. He had grown to love not just the twins, but the sense of purpose and belonging they had given him. The prospect of remaining part of their lives while helping them connect with their cultural roots was more than he had dared to hope for. The discussion continued late into the night, with various tribal members weighing in on the unprecedented situation. Some expressed concern about accepting an outsider into their close-knit community. Others argued that Jake's actions had proven his character and commitment to the twins' welfare. Through it all, Ayanna and Dakota sat close to Jake, their small hands resting trustingly on his arms as the adults debated their future. As the council prepared to make their decision, Jake realized that his choice had already been made months ago when he first held two frozen children in his arms. Whatever the outcome, his days of running from human connection were over. The giant trapper had finally learned that some responsibilities were worth embracing, and some families were created by love rather than blood. The tribal council's decision came at dawn, delivered by the eldest member of the group, a weathered man named Thomas Sitting Eagle, whose wisdom was respected throughout the territory. His words were carefully chosen and spoke to both tradition and the unusual circumstances they faced. "The children have chosen their path with their hearts," he announced in English, then repeated in Cree. "Jake Morrison has proven himself worthy of their trust and ours. He will be welcomed as family with all the responsibilities that brings." The formal adoption ceremony took place 3 days later, incorporating both Cree traditions and acknowledgments of Jake's own heritage. Marie worked with other tribal women to create special clothing for the occasion, including a beautifully beaded vest for Jake that marked his acceptance into the community. Ayanna and Dakota wore traditional outfits that had belonged to other family members, their faces glowing with happiness at having their worlds united. Jake found himself overwhelmed by the ceremony's emotional power. As part of the ritual, he was given a Cree name, Mistahi Masqua, meaning Great Bear, in recognition of both his physical size and his protective nature toward the twins. The name felt right in a way his birth name never had, representing not just who he was, but who he had become through his relationship with the children. The practical challenges of his new life began immediately after the ceremony. Jake had to learn not just the language more fluently, but the complex social customs that governed tribal life. Everything from how to address different family members to the proper protocols for hunting and sharing resources had to be mastered. The twins became his eager teachers, delighting in their role reversal as they helped their guardian navigate their world. Setting up a new life proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. The temporary camp where the scattered tribe had gathered was never meant to be permanent, and decisions had to be made about where to establish a more lasting settlement. Jake's wilderness expertise proved invaluable in these discussions, as he could assess potential locations for water sources, hunting grounds, and defensive advantages. His knowledge of dealing with government officials also became crucial when representatives arrived to discuss the tribe's legal status and land rights. The bureaucrats were initially suspicious of Jake's presence and questioned whether he was somehow exploiting the situation for personal gain. However, Marie and the other tribal leaders made it clear that Jake was family and would be treated as such in all negotiations. The twins thrived in their expanded family environment, but they maintained their special bond with Jake. They had their own small teepee next to his, and they continued many of the routines they had established during their time in the cabin. Every morning they would help him check his trap lines, now relocated closer to the new settlement. Every evening they would sit by his fire while he carved wooden toys or repaired equipment, listening to stories that blended his wilderness adventures with traditional Cree tales he was learning from the elders. Ayana's intelligence and leadership qualities became more apparent as she grew comfortable in the larger community. She quickly mastered both languages completely and often served as a translator between Jake and other tribal members. Her ability to move between the two worlds made her invaluable in helping the community adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their cultural identity. Takota's artistic talents flourished in the new environment. The traditional crafts taught by his aunts and uncles combined with techniques he had learned from Jake to create a unique style that impressed everyone in the community. His wooden carvings began incorporating traditional Cree symbols and stories, creating pieces that were both beautiful and culturally significant. As the seasons changed, Jake found himself taking on more responsibilities within the tribe. His hunting skills were exceptional, and he began teaching younger men techniques he had learned during his solitary years. His carpentry abilities were put to use constructing more permanent structures as the community established its new settlement. Most importantly, his experience dealing with the outside world made him a valuable liaison with traders, government officials, and neighboring communities. The first real test of Jake's commitment came during a harsh winter, when food supplies ran dangerously low. Several families were on the verge of starvation, and traditional hunting grounds had been disrupted by increased military patrols in the region. Jake made the difficult decision to leave his new family temporarily and venture into the deep wilderness, where he knew he could find game that others might miss. His week-long solo hunting expedition brought back enough meat to sustain the community through the worst of the winter, but it also reminded him of how different his life had become. The silence and isolation that had once been his refuge now felt empty, without the laughter of children and the warmth of community life. He realized that his transformation was complete. The solitary giant trapper was truly gone, replaced by a man who had found his purpose in caring for others. When spring arrived, it brought new challenges and opportunities. Government policies regarding Native communities were changing, and there were rumors of forced relocations to distant reservations. Jake's knowledge of legal procedures and his contacts among white settlers made him an important advocate for the tribe's rights. He began traveling to territorial offices and court hearings, using his unique position as both an adopted tribal member and a white man to argue for the community's right to remain on their chosen land. The twins, now approaching their 6th birthday, had grown strong and confident under the loving care of their extended family. They spoke both languages fluently and were learning traditional skills while also maintaining the wilderness knowledge Jake had taught them. Their resilience in overcoming their early trauma had made them sources of inspiration for other children in the community who had experienced losses during the violent incidents that had scattered the tribe. As summer approached, Jake reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From a broken man fleeing his grief in the wilderness to a respected member of a thriving community, his transformation had been as dramatic as anything he could have imagined. The twins had not just saved his life by giving him purpose. They had shown him what it truly meant to be part of something larger than himself. The greatest test of their bond as a family was yet to come, however, as outside forces began to threaten the peaceful life they had built together. The choices Jake would soon face would determine not just his own future, but the fate of everyone he had come to love. The crisis that would test everything Jake and his adopted family had built together arrived on a blazing hot day in July. A contingent of mounted soldiers rode into their settlement with official papers and grim expressions, led by a young lieutenant who seemed uncomfortable with his assignment. The documents they carried ordered the immediate relocation of the entire tribe to a government reservation 300 miles to the north, in territory that everyone knew was unsuitable for sustaining a community. Jake stood with the tribal council as they listened to the lieutenant read the official decree. The government had decided that scattered native groups needed to be consolidated for easier administration and control. There would be no negotiations, no appeals, and no delays. They had 2 weeks to gather their possessions and begin the forced march to their new home, or face military action against the entire community. The lieutenant's eyes kept darting to Jake during the reading, clearly puzzled by the presence of a white man among the tribal leadership. After the official business was concluded, he approached Jake privately and offered what he seemed to think was helpful advice. "You don't have to go with them," he said quietly. "You're a white man. You can stay here or go anywhere you want. Why tie yourself to people who are headed for a hard life on the reservation?" Jake's response was immediate and firm. "These are my people, and those children are my family. Where they go, I go." The lieutenant shook his head in bewilderment, unable to understand why anyone would voluntarily accept such a fate when they had other options. That night, the community held an emergency council meeting that lasted until dawn. Some argued for compliance, believing that resistance would only bring more violence and suffering. Others wanted to flee deeper into the wilderness, hoping to find territory where they could live free from government interference. A few of the younger men spoke angrily about fighting back, refusing to be driven from another home. Jake listened to all the arguments before speaking. His words carried weight because of his unique position and his proven commitment to the community. "I've seen what happens when good people are forced to make impossible choices," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We can't win a fight against the army, and running will just delay the inevitable, but that doesn't mean we're powerless." His proposal was both simple and audacious. Instead of simply submitting to the relocation order, Jake suggested they use his connections and legal knowledge to fight the decision through proper channels while simultaneously preparing for the worst. He would travel to the territorial capital and hire a lawyer, using his savings from years of trapping to fund a legal challenge. Meanwhile, the community would begin preparations for the journey north, but also send scouts to identify alternative locations where they might establish a new settlement if the legal fight failed. The plan required sacrifices from everyone, but it offered something that simple compliance or futile resistance could not: hope. Marie and the other tribal leaders agreed to the strategy, understanding that Jake's unique position as both a white man and an adopted tribal member might give their legal challenge a chance of success that would be impossible otherwise. Jake's departure for the territorial capital was one of the hardest moments of his life. Ayanna and Dakota clung to him, terrified that he might not return, their memories of previous separations and losses making this goodbye especially painful. He knelt down to their level and made them a solemn promise. "No matter what happens, no matter where we end up, we will always be together. I will never abandon you, and I will never stop fighting for our family." The legal battle that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The lawyer he hired, a principled man named William Harrison, who had previously defended native rights, explained the harsh reality of their situation. The government's legal authority to relocate tribes was virtually absolute, and courts rarely intervened in such matters. However, there were procedural requirements that hadn't been properly followed in this case, and the specific reservation designated for the relocation had been promised to another tribe in a previous treaty. For 6 weeks, Jake lived in a small boarding house in the capital, spending his days in law offices and courtrooms while his nights were filled with worry about his family. Letters from Marie kept him informed about life in the settlement, where people were struggling to maintain hope while preparing for an uncertain future. The children were attending makeshift schools and helping with daily tasks, but their letters to Jake revealed their anxiety about what lay ahead. The breakthrough came when Harrison discovered that the army captain who had signed the relocation order had exceeded his authority. The decision should have been reviewed by territorial administrators and approved by officials in the capital, but the captain had acted independently based on outdated information. This procedural violation gave them grounds for a formal challenge that could at least delay the relocation, while proper procedures were followed. Jake's moment of truth came during a hearing before a territorial judge, who would decide whether to issue a temporary injunction against the relocation order. Jake took the stand as a witness, describing his life with the tribe and arguing that the community posed no threat to anyone and had actually improved relations between native peoples and white settlers in their region. His testimony was passionate and personal, focusing not on legal technicalities but on the human cost of forcing peaceful families from their homes. The judge's decision was delivered 3 days later. The relocation order was suspended pending a full review by territorial administrators, and the tribe would be allowed to remain in their current location while the matter was properly investigated. It wasn't a complete victory, but it bought them precious time and established an important legal precedent. Jake's return to the settlement was met with celebration, but he knew their fight was far from over. The temporary victory had strengthened the community's resolve and demonstrated that resistance through legal channels was possible. More importantly, it had shown neighboring white settlers and government officials that this particular tribe had an effective advocate who understood both worlds. The twins' reaction to his return revealed how much they had matured during his absence. Instead of the clingy neediness he had expected, they showed him proudly around improvements they had made to their living areas and shared stories of how they had helped other children cope with the uncertainty. Their resilience and growth reminded Jake that his greatest accomplishment wasn't saving them from the forest, but helping them develop the strength to face whatever challenges life might bring. In the months that followed, Jake's role in the community evolved once again. He became not just a family member and provider, but a bridge between two worlds that seemed increasingly at odds with each other. His success in fighting the relocation order had earned him respect among government officials who began consulting him on other native affairs, while his unwavering loyalty to his adopted family had cemented his place in tribal leadership. Years later, as Jake watched Ayanna and Dakota grow into capable young adults who moved confidently between their traditional heritage and the changing modern world, he often reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. Two desperate children freezing in a forest had somehow managed to save a broken man who thought his life was over. In teaching them to survive, he had learned to truly live. The giant trapper who had once fled from human connection had discovered that the greatest treasures in life couldn't be caught in traps or found in solitude. They were found in the moment when you opened your heart to someone who needed you and realized that saving them had actually saved yourself. The twins had taught him that family wasn't about blood or tradition, but about choosing to love someone enough to sacrifice everything for their happiness and well-being. Their story became legend in the territory, told around campfires and in trading posts as an example of how unexpected connections could transform lives and bridge the gaps between different peoples. But for Jake, Ayanna, and Dakota, it was simply the foundation of a family built on love, courage, and the unshakable belief that no one should ever have to face the wilderness alone.